Today's presentation is on forage quality and toxic plant concerns during drought conditions. I'm Dr. Tim Evans at the University of Missouri. I'm in the College of Veterinary Medicine, and I'm also an MU Extension State Specialist in Veterinary Toxicology. As we're all aware right now, we're experiencing a drought in the state of Missouri. So in this particular case, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we're going to deal with some of the concerns about forage quality and toxic plants. But first, as we look at this slide, it's letting you know a little bit what my perspective is. From the standpoint of me as a person, I'm a half full kind of guy, okay? Very optimistic. But my job as a veterinary toxicologist is half empty. No one calls me on the phone and says, "Hey, how are you doing today? The cows look great." No, there's always 25 dead cows. Really, 25 dead cows. Now, I recently gave this presentation and people said, well, the solution to that problem is to only have 24 or 26. Well, no, the point is that for some reason, people think that they don't need to call me or talk to me until they've got 25 dead cows. And it's amazing how that works. Now, from that, I then decided that that number 25 shows up a lot of places in this particular presentation. It seems like it always takes at least 25 dead cows for producers to call me. We're going to be talking about how we express nitrate concentrations in forages. And there's two basic ways: parts per million of nitrate and parts per million of nitrate nitrogen. Well, if you take the parts per million of nitrate, 25% of that is what the parts per million of nitrate nitrogen is. This gets confusing to people, and I'm not going to go into why that works out. It's just remember that whenever you see what the concentration of is nitrate, and that's where we make a lot of our decisions with respect to forages and intoxications. If you go ahead and get parts per million nitrate nitrogen, you're going to have to multiply that by 4 to get its equivalent in nitrate. Another 2,500 parts per million of dietary nitrate is considered ideal, especially for pregnant cattle. So again, we're going to be talking a lot in 25 of various different units. So, what producers can be doing now to address drought-related issues in their livestock? Well, cull the herd and wean calves early. I've put a number of links from Beef Magazine that will talk about best ways to cull cattle, a smart producer's guide to marketing culled cow, how to get more value from your culled cows, how to cull the right cow without keeping records. That might be a little challenging, but cull early and often to keep your cow herd productive. Rethink cow culling priorities. So you can go to those links. We also have weaning calves early. And certainly, if we wean the calves, then the energy requirements for the cows are going to decrease and we can get them in better condition. Also, we can facilitate feeding the calves better and stimulating their growth. Now, we also have fine alternative feeds. And again, we see a picture of silage. And we're also going to be checking toxicity of alternative feedstuffs. One of the ones that which many of you are familiar with is going to be nitrate toxicity or nitrate nitrite poisoning. You get high nitrate in the forage, you get in the rumen, nitrate goes to nitrite. Ultimately, it'd like to go to ammonia, but in certain circumstances, when you get excessive nitrite, it goes in the blood and it modifies hemoglobin into what's called methemoglobin. What you get is chocolate brown blood. It won't carry oxygen to the same degree. Prepare for the fall and the winter. I have a question mark here. Under the usual conditions we have in Missouri, we can use stockpiled E+ tall fescue. But right now, under drought conditions, a lot of our endophyte infected tall fescue is not flourishing like it normally does. And a lot of it is not creating the stands that we need for that stockpiling in the fall. The other thing right now that there's a concern is, what are we going to be doing with hay? We're going to need hay to get through the winter. Are we going to have enough? Number 5, we can stretch current feed supplies and reduce hay waste. The first picture on the left shows wheat straw, which can be ammoniated to be used as an alternative forage. The picture on the right shows that having properly sized bales and appropriate feeders is going to prevent wastage. We can also go ahead and consider the inclusion of ionophores in the diet to include feed efficiency, but that's a decision that needs to be made with your veterinarian. Talking about veterinarians can help at least 5 ways during a drought. One is assistance in making culling decisions. So preg checking. Pregnant cows can eat a certain amount, and a non-pregnant cow, for the most part, is going to eat about the same amount. So we want to get those productive cows. Animals with foot problems that are lame, that's going to be a problem. Other health problems, particular disposition, cattle which are particularly excitable, that aren't having a good day unless they've injured farm personnel. Those aren't the cows you want to be keeping around. Veterinarians also can give advice on water quality issues and feeding alternative forages. On the left, we have what we would like some water to look like. And on the right, with drought conditions, we may even possibly be having some harmful algal bloom in some of those areas that we see. Veterinarians can also help in the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of water forage-associated intoxications in animals. We have a veterinarian examining a cow that is suspected of having nitrate poisoning. Performance of post-mortem exams on dead animals. Again, here's a graph showing when we open the animal up, and then the variety of sampling, the labeling. We have samples that are put in formalin for histologic examination by pathologists, and we have other tissues that can be used for other types of diagnostic purposes. Recommendations on herd health programs. That's an important way that veterinarians work with producers. And so looking at the circular graph from MU Extension, we've got pre-calving, evaluation of body condition score, cows, vaccination, scours for calf immunity, calving, ensure adequate colostrum. Again, the scours vaccine, if the dam is not vaccinated, we give that to the calves. We get into pre-breeding, parasite control for spring calving herds, cows and heifers, a variety of vaccinations for different types of diseases. And again, as we get into breeding, no vaccinations, parasite control for spring calving herds, and then calves, we get into pre-weaning, calves health management protocols, and then vaccination of the calves. And then into weaning, calves get their vaccination and parasite control for fall calving herds. And then we get into pre-calving, we get evaluation of body condition score and adjust nutrition. And then, as we started before, we're back into this triangle. Cows are vaccinated with the scours vaccine for calf immunity. So I think you can see all the various ways that veterinarians can contribute to helping producers make the right decisions in their production scheme. So, talking about some of the drought-related toxic plant issues, we've got nitrate intoxication. I know many of you have heard a lot about this right now, but again, especially in drought-stressed sorghum species. Prussic acid, cyanide concerns, especially after rain-stimulated regrowth, new growth of sorghum species like Johnson grass. Possibly some drought-studded sorghum species may also be associated with the production of cyanide. Don't graze sorghum species unless they're at least 24 inches tall, okay? E+ tall fescue and erget contaminated grasses. Both of these have the potential, with the toxins they contain, to predispose cattle to heat stress. We already have a drought and already have elevated environmental temperatures. E+ tall fescue and erget contaminated grasses will make any hyperthermia, animals having elevated temperatures, that much worse. Harmful algal blooms, got neurotoxic, causing seizures, convulsions, and hepatotoxic, toxic to the liver. We have those two types of harmful algal blooms. Other increased toxic risks to consider, we have plants and pastures and hay that can cause seizures and convulsions, poison hemlock and water hemlock. Plants and pastures and hay causing heart problems. We have milkweed, we have Hemp Dogbane, and also a common ornamental plant, yew, Y-E-W, can also be cardiotoxic. So we definitely don't want our neighbors helping us by trimming their yew bushes and putting those in our pastures. or a member of our family going ahead and trimming the yew bushes and think that they're helping with the livestock by putting that in the pastures. The other important thing is, with respect to yew, is make sure that the fences are in repair and to make sure that they are secured shut. All right, nitrate accumulating plants. There's quite a few of them. Lamb's quarter, pearl millet, commoner proso millet, E plus tall fescue. Corn, particularly in the stalks. Wheat, oats, again, can also accumulate nitrate. Most of the nitrate accumulation is primarily in the stalks. Here are some nitrate accumulating weeds, and you can see there's a wide range of weeds that can accumulate nitrate. Got the genus and species on the left. We've got the common names on the right. Amaranthus pigweed is a big one. Brassica species, the mustards, lamb's quarters, and in addition, sorghum halipens, Johnson grass. That's a big one, but there certainly are other plants as well. Then we have nitrate accumulating crops. So certainly we have oats, we have certainly barley, alfalfa can also accumulate nitrate. A lot of people aren't aware of that. And I've had some situations in the past where people were giving their cattle a lot of alfalfa that had nitrate in it, and it was causing some health problems. Alfalfa also accumulates nitrate in the leaves. So certainly the millets, and then forage, sorghum, sudan, wheat, and then of course corn. So we've talked about this. So not only do we have a lot of weeds that accumulate nitrate, especially under drought stress, we also have a lot of crops that have that potential. So what are the clinical signs of nitrite intoxication? Well, what we'll see is because you get this methemoglobinemia, you can get a brownish tinge to the mucous membranes. And you can see this actually is very visible in the volva. You see going from pink to a chocolate brown. We can also see it in the blood, although that can be fairly subjective. But chocolate brown blood, methemoglobinemia, it's not binding oxygen. And getting this hypoxia, we can have animals that can die, can get a subacute, subchronic effect with elevated dietary nitrates. And we can also get premature parturition, possibly abortion. So when we're having in a normal year, how do we manage issues related to the risk of nitrate poisoning? One of the things that we can do is avoid excessive fertilizer. We can screen for nitrate in suspect forages using the spot test. It's a qualitative test. So again, showing in the illustrations here, extension personnel can help with making recommendations on fertilizer application. And here we show below the diphenylamine spot test. You put that on the plant. A lot of times it's just a test at the nodes. And a dark blue means that there is nitrate. The level of detection is about 1,000 parts per million, which is quite a bit below when you start seeing the intoxication. Another way to do that is using a vice grip, get out some of the juice that's in that material, and then add the diphenylamine to that, and you can see the dark blue color. But it's a qualitative test. It tells you that there's nitrate. In some cases, individuals have used that to say, well, this is a lot darker blue, etc. But there are some variations in that quantitative evaluation that may not be accurate. So when we get a positive spot test, we'll want to do quantitative testing because, again, the spot test is essentially, for all intents and purposes, a qualitative test. It simply tells us that there is some accumulation, but what is the concentration? Again, I want to make the point, we said 25% of the part per million nitrate equals the part per million of nitrate nitrogen. So again, 0 to 2,500 parts per million is generally considered safe. But that would be equivalent to 0 to 550 parts per million of nitrate nitrogen. Then we get to 2,500 to 5,000. That's the caution range. When we're looking at nitrate, that's 550 to 1,100 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. That's a caution. Oftentimes, when we have a choice, when we have a forage that is readily available during what we would call a good year, we would say we wouldn't want to put materials 25 to 5,000. we'd want to go ahead and be a little bit cautious in combination with non-protein nitrogen supplements and limit forage with nitrate levels, particularly as you're getting up to 5,000 to 1/2 of the total ration. Then we get into the danger category, 5,000 to 15,000 parts per million nitrate. That's 1,100 to 3,400 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. And again, you want to be very careful about how much of this particular forage is in this range you include in the diet. And what we see is that we can get potential reproductive problems. Premature parturition, abortion can be reported over 5,000 parts per million. We certainly don't want to be feeding pregnant cattle over 5,000 parts per million. And there are some anecdotal reports of cattle mortality at greater than 10,000 parts per million. So while there are forages that are greater than 15,000 parts per million nitrate, I really try to keep the forages that are included in the diet to be not any greater than 10,000 parts per million. Again, if you're looking under good conditions, when we have plenty of forage, well, we can limit some of that forage in this danger level to 1/4 of the total ration. Certainly supplement forage with energy, minerals, and vitamin A. And again, when we will be discussing in the next couple of slides where we might have to go ahead and use in our current drought situation where we're limited with the number of forages that are available, then we might have to go ahead and use forages with nitrate concentrations in this particular level, but we ideally would like to limit it to about 1/4 of the total ration. Of course, we might not always be able to do that. And in those cases, we want to supplement forage with energy, minerals, and vitamin A. More than 15,000 parts per million nitrate, okay, it's equivalent to more than 3,400 parts per million nitrate. Nitrogen is toxic, just shouldn't be fed under any circumstances. And being a veterinarian, I probably would really like to avoid feeding forages greater than 10,000 parts per million unless I absolutely have to. And if I'm going to recommend that, then we're certainly going to have to supplement with soluble energy such as mixed grains and possibly vitamin A. To try and make the point of why it is important to know whether the nitrate status is being measured in terms of nitrate itself or in terms of nitrate nitrogen, let's look and see here that if we go to 1,100 to 3,400 parts per million nitrate, that's generally going to be relatively safe. It's going to be in the safe, perhaps getting into the cautious range. But if we have 1,100 to 3,400 parts per million nitrate nitrogen, that's potentially dangerous. We could potentially have animal mortality. Okay, again, when we're talking about situations during relatively good years, when we have plenty of forage, we generally like to avoid feeding green chopped corn. Okay, oftentimes if we're going to chop it, we'll just go ahead and ensile it, and that's fine. There are particular risks associated with feeding green chopped corn. And so, again, that's something oftentimes we'll avoid, and we'll cover that in a little greater detail. During good years, we can rely on stockpiled E+ tall fescue for fall grazing. Okay, you can see in the slide below that there's a particular point in time where you're going to want to fertilize for that fall stockpile, but that's going to increase the number of cattle that you can be grazing on that particular forage. The other thing is we certainly want to be, in most situations, when we have good years for forage, we want to have plenty of hay for feeding our cattle during the winter. Now, let's talk about what we're trying to deal with right now in the 2023 drought recommendations for dietary nitrate concentrations. Obviously, that 0 to 2,500 parts per million is ideal during pregnancy, especially during the last trimester, P3. But this year, it may be difficult to find low nitrate forages in this particular drought situation. So pregnant cows, especially during P3, the last trimester, should take precedence for these low nitrate forages. Now, again, as we've mentioned earlier, we may have to, under the current situations, venture into the caution range, 2,500 to 5,000 parts per million nitrate. Try to maintain the dietary nitrate concentrations less than 4,000 parts per million in pregnant animals, especially the last trimester. How do we reduce the risks of dietary nitrate in the caution range? Well, producer consultation with extension personnel and their veterinarian. Supplementation with soluble carbohydrates, such as mixed grains. Gradual introduction of fed cattle to new forages, pastures. Supervision of cattle with dietary nitrate concentrations greater than 5,000 parts per million. Now, certainly in the situation that we're in right now, we may be having to use some forages in the 5,000 to 15,000 range for non-pregnant cattle. So again, there's potential reproductive problems. Some anecdotal reports of cattle mortality greater than 10,000. So how are we going to reduce the risk of feeding forages where the dietary nitrate is going to be in the danger range? Well, we're going to use the same procedures as above for the caution range. We're going to consult with extension personnel and veterinarians. We're going to supplement with soluble carbohydrates, such as mixed grains. We're going to do gradual introduction of fed cattle to new forages, pastures. Again, if possible, we want to keep dietary nitrate less than or equal to 5,000 parts per million to pregnant animals. I'd like to get less than 4,000 if I can. If possible, I'd like to avoid dietary nitrate concentrations greater than or equal to 10,000 parts per million in any animals. But then there may be, based on the current literature, possible accession of brassica species. Cover crops are being grazed. Again, those particular crops are going to be primarily moisture. So the quantitative nitrate analysis, which is reported on a dry weight basis, is going to overestimate the nitrate content. And in addition, brassica species have higher sulfur content that may go ahead and decrease the risk of nitrate poisoning. If we're at more than 15,000 parts per million, that's potentially lethal to animals susceptible to nitrate poisoning. So it's not suitable for feeding. Now, quantitative nitrate results using quantitative as compared to the spot test is critical for dietary management during drought. Nutritional analysis can also provide additional critical information for diet formulation. And diets greater than or equal to the caution range for dietary nitrate must be supplemented with grain. I've also provided 2 references as far as websites you could go to for additional information. So on this slide, we're looking at some other ways that we can reduce the risk of nitrite intoxication in cattle while being able to use alternative forages. It will be critical to ensile high nitrate forages to decrease the nitrate concentrations. Optimally, 60 days of ensiling to get 33% to 50% reduction in nitrate. The current lack of forage may also necessitate feeding green chopped corn and perhaps other forages. So cut and feed green chopped corn, other forages as you go. Green chop from drought stressed corn should be cut and fed 2 to 3 times daily. Do not leave green chop in piles or in a wagon overnight. The nitrate in the forage will be converted to extremely toxic nitrite in the accumulated green chop. If possible, test quantitative nitrate nutritional quality before feeding, and again, increase the amount of the green chop being fed gradually. The next topic I want to talk about is prunus and sorghum species and cyanide intoxication. Both of these types of plants have sugars that contain a cyanide group. And so in ruminants, they can consume these, particularly the leaves in prunus species, cherry trees, and again, also the leaves in the sorghum species. And in the rumen, the sugars are released from the cyanide, and you develop the cyanide, then is absorbed in the blood and can cause the animal to die. It essentially causes a cellular anoxia. The oxygen in the blood doesn't go to the tissues. So usually when we have a problem with prunus species is when they get into an area where there are cherry trees, or the wind blows down a branch and the cattle eat the leaves. In the situation with the sorghum species, what we're going to see is potentially in a drought condition where we go ahead and we have not very much growing in the pasture, all of a sudden, like we did 2 to 3 weeks ago, we get a bunch of rain, a lot of moisture, and these sorghum species all of a sudden rapidly start a new growth. Some will call it a regrowth, but new growth, regrowth of the plant material. And they concentrate the cyanogenic glycosides, the sugar that contains cyanide, in the leaf material. And unbeknownst to many producers, they're excited that they're getting new growth of this plant material, but they've been thinking about nitrate. They're not thinking about the fact that this new growth is going to have the potential for causing cyanide intoxication, and that's going to be in the leaf material. So, Johnson grass and cyanide intoxication. Again, many of these pictures, the dead cattle are actually in another country, but the rest of the pictures are taken in Missouri after about 2 weeks of having some rain. And where you see the pressure spots in that top picture, that's where about a half of a herd ended up dying in those areas. They just collapsed and fell because all of a sudden there was no oxygen going to the tissues. You see a close-up of what it looked like, and you can see the Johnson grass with the white stripe going down the center of the leaf material. And again, as we talked before, it's not uncommon to get 25 dead cows or even more. Again, in the recent example, there were cattle in a pasture which had very little forage in it. They were then led into a pasture with lots of green forage, a lot of it being Johnson grass, which was very palatable, very tasty, which they ate, and then they died suddenly over a 3 to 4 hour period of time. We can also see Sudan grass can also potentially be associated with cyanide intoxication. And as we look at this Sudan grass, we'll see that some of this grass is pretty stunted and wasn't really progressing in its growth. So, what happens with cyanide intoxication? Basically, the mitochondria of the cell is what produces energy. And so cyanide prevents a particular enzyme in the mitochondria from working. And so what happens is the tissues can't use the oxygen. The mitochondria is in the tissues. You inhibit that particular enzyme. It can't use oxygen. Oxygen stays in the blood, cherry red blood. And because of the cellular anoxia, that means no oxygen in the cells. You get rapid death. These animals die very, very quickly. And what we end up seeing, we talked about with sorghum species, that we can have nitrate, nitrite intoxication, chocolate brown blood, and we can also have, because that's usually with the stemmy parts of the plant, we can also have cyanide intoxication, cherry red blood. Now, again, to a certain degree, this is fairly subjective, but again, these are the things that we can observe. This is an example of a cattle mortality involving a prunus species that actually happened in September a few years ago. The cattle were put out in a fescue pasture. It was really hot. They became hypothermic. They weren't feeling very well. They were laying underneath the trees and stripping the trees of the lower leaves. These were prunus species trees, and we had cattle dying. How many cows? 25. And again, we can see a picture of what cherry red blood, particularly early on in an intoxication, will look like. So, reducing risk for cyanide intoxication involving sorghum species. Do not graze sorghum species less than or equal to 24 inches tall, okay? Do not feed hay. You can cut the grass that you're concerned about. You can make hay. Do not feed that hay for 2 weeks. You can also ensile it for 60 to 90 days before feeding. Then the question becomes testing for cyanogenic potential before feeding. Definitely my recommendation would be to go ahead and consider having tested for cyanogenic potential. The veterinary medical diagnostic lab does that testing. They can also test for quantitative nitrate. I think definitely in the fresh grass. Some people will say you don't need to check it in the hay or in the silage. Again, if it can be done, I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. Certainly you want to do supplementation with soluble carbohydrates. such as mixed grains, when we're concerned about cyanide intoxication, as well as nitrate, nitrite intoxication. Always gradual introduction of fed cattle to new forages, pastures, and careful supervision of cattle if previous concerns about prussic acid. So what we see here in the pictures below, in some regions of the country, we have square bales containing sorghum sudan, Johnson grass. We can also have round bales. That's what we see a lot in Missouri. And then we have a picture of someone going ahead and cutting the sorghum sudan and then putting it in and siling it. And again, that's another way to not only reduce any nitrate, but also a way to reduce or prevent the cyanide. All right, we talked a little bit about E+tol fescue, the toxins, the ergopeptine alkaloids in those plants can cause cattle to get summer slump, hyperthermia. And in the map below, we are very much in the fescue belt. Erget is kind of like E+tol fescue on anabolic steroids. Okay, it has a whole lot more of the ergot alkaloids, especially the ergopeptine alkaloids. And they see these little growths look like little rodent fecal material. And endophyte infected tall fescue is also susceptible to being ergotized. And in fact, in the picture in the lower right, I have a picture of what that actually looks like. Even in our drought conditions, we had some early spring rains and we had some ergot infection in tall fescue. So ergotized E+tol fescue, and I use purple font here because it causes vasoconstriction. All right, during the summer when we have drought, we can also have problems with our ponds and we can get harmful algal blooms. Usually what happens is there's a change in weather and a transition, and all of a sudden these blue-green algae, another fancy name for that is cyanobacteria, can go ahead and actually explode in their growth. They create a bloom, and the bloom is what is toxic. This one is a neurotoxic blue-green algae, Anabaena floss aqua, and it can cause seizures, convulsions, and other neurological effects. Has two toxins, anatoxin A and anatoxin AS. But again, these organisms are arranged in a chain. We can also get another type of cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, Microcystis aeruginosa. It accumulates in clumps, and oftentimes those blooms are like fluorescent green, and they can cause acute liver failure. The toxins in that particular harmful algae can cause liver failure. We talked earlier about the fact that there are some neurotoxic plants that can cause seizures and convulsions and birth defects. Poison hemlock is an excellent example. It has that umbelliferous, like an umbrella flower, but it's got purple spots on the stem. It's got parsley-like leaves. You can see a detailed picture of the leaves and the purple spots. We see a lot of it in the state of Missouri. The other thing is the toxins that are in it are also toxic when it's in the hay. Okay. Oftentimes, this is what we'll see. We may see a single plant, or we may see a whole bunch of poison hemlock along a road or in a part of a pasture. This time of the year, most of it is either very dried or looking like that final picture there. But again, whether it gets into hay, whether it is consumed by the animal, it's very, very poisonous, and we want to avoid that. It can also cause birth defects. It can cause deformities in the limbs and in the spine. So we get calves that are called crooked calf syndrome. It's probably because of poison hemlock. Usually in cases where this happens, the exposure is in the first trimester of the pregnancy. So by the time you see the calf, you may not see the poison hemlock at all. Another plant that can probably cause seizures and convulsions is water hemlock. In the root, it has these horizontal plates, has a similar umbelliferous flower, but the leaves are very different. They're not parsley-like leaves. We also have some cardiotoxic plants that affect the heart. So again, many people have yew as an ornamental plant in their front yard, their backyard. You definitely do not want to feed that to your cattle. You definitely don't want your neighbors to go ahead and trim their yew bushes or yew trees and put that in your pasture. You want to make sure that your fences are secure and make sure that the gates are kept closed. Milkweed is another plant that can cause heart problems. It has compounds related to digitalis and digoxin. And we've seen a lot of milkweed along the roads. This is what it looks like. Broadleaf, this particular is broadleaf milkweed, has a typical flower. This year, we've seen an awful lot of hemp dogbane growing in pastures and along roads. Has a very different leaf, has a very different flower, kind of has these reddish stems, but this could be very toxic as well, causing cardiac arrhythmias and heart failure. And then another plant that is often easily recognized is Perilla Mint. It has a square stem, likes to grow in the shade, and it's very readily identifiable. And so oftentimes people will see it growing, and if they have any problems with the cattle in that area, they will say, well, if they die, it has to be because of the Perilla Mint. But oftentimes that's not the case. Oftentimes cattle will not eat the Perilla Mint unless they're really, really hungry, if they just don't have other forages to eat. And usually when we see problems with Perilla Mint, we see premonitory signs. We see signs that look like a pneumonia before the animals die. And so in the top row, we see Perilla Mint, can have purplish-like leaves, has a square stem, typical flower. We can see these cattle having respiratory signs. We have this lung looking like acute bovine pulmonary edema and emphysema, where we have changes within the alveoli where the cells that are very good at gas exchange are destroyed and other cuboidal type cells are produced that don't do gas exchange very well. And so we get respiratory problems. This has been a summary of some of the more common forage quality issues and toxic plant problems that you may see this summer with the drought.